So, hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels Podcast. This week, I'm joined just by our Executive Director, Frank Furedi. Welcome.
Nice to talk to you.
Because we've got many important things, and especially over the last few days, really, two events have happened that have really kind of shaken Europe to its core in many ways. The first is the announcement that they have annulled the first round and indeed the whole process of the presidential election in Romania. And the second is the collapse of Michel Barnier's government in France and the crisis that throws for Emmanuel Macron. So I'm delighted, and Frank and I are going to dig into both of these things in a little more detail than usual. So the first of those, which really, to us, it was a kind of political earthquake, an anti-democratic outrage, was the announcement that the Romania's Constitutional Court announced the complete annulment of the presidential process, which comes following the shock success of total outsider, Russian sympathizer, strange health food fanatic Georgescu, who has, you can disagree or agree with Georgescu's policies, but the announcement that they've decided to completely cancel an entire election simply because he's such an outsider, said to throw NATO into question, etc., etc. But more than that, I think it's because of his outsider status and the fact that neither of the two main parties even made it into the second round. So, Frank, aside from this being, or maybe we start there, is this as anti-democratic and outrageous as it seems?
Well, it's totally anti-democratic, and it sets a very important precedent because there's a wider trend throughout Europe towards the elites, the judiciary and the political elites, essentially trying to delegitimate elections where the populist parties and individuals have succeeded. So these days, every time a populist movement forges forward, you inevitably have this claim that the Russians have intervened, that somehow the social media has been manipulated and the elections are not fair. But this is the first time that they're going to step beyond that. And not only did they claim that the election was somehow influenced by the wrong kind of people, but they've actually annulled the result of a democratically held election. I think we need to be also very clear what has happened, because the claim that he's a complete outsider, Georgescu, is not true. Georgescu has been involved in politics in Romania for a very, very long time. Indeed, some of the centrist parties and other parties have actually suggested that he either become minister, has even been talked about as a future potential prime minister. So he's not a complete outsider. He is, however, very much against the EU mainstream and its politics, all kinds of weird and other kind of ways. Is antithetical to the narrative that is dominant in Brussels. But what is very interesting here is that the idea that somehow Russia has invested so much money in TikTok that it could actually swing the election is bizarre. First of all, it's bizarre because most of the people, or a large proportion of the people that voted for Georgescu, live in the rural area, the countryside. They're essentially people who are farmers and peasants. They don't, on balance, hang out on TikTok. That's not the main media that they use. So that just is just not credible. But secondly, even if the Russians had used TikTok, at the end of the day, it was Romanian citizens rather than Russian spies who put the vote into the ballot box. So the whole thing is a fantasy that was created by the elite in order to delegitimate an election and ultimately to call the democratic process of decision-making into question.
Yeah, and I mean, lots of this is focused on this production of a dossier, a kind of a new dodgy dossier to those of us who remember the run-up to the Iraq War in the UK, but a dossier by Romania's security services that alleges huge involvement of various bots and Russian influence and stuff on TikTok. And it isn't the point, Frank, that even if this kind of hastily produced, obviously propagandistic piece of reportage, even if it was entirely true, we're still talking about numbers in terms of social media that are not particularly significant. We're talking about thousands or maybe at the push kind of a million or counts or so. That this, by social media standards, this is not an enormous number of users. But secondly, that it's one thing to say that people there's an influence operation going on, right? But which may or may not be true. But quite another thing to say that therefore it completely delegitimizes the election, because what you're effectively saying is that some speech is not allowed to be heard because of where it originates.
That's right. And it's very interesting that the other candidate, who's a social democratic candidate, who also surprised everybody by coming
Yeah.
second. She wasn't targeted in the same kind of a way because of her politics being a little bit closer to that of the Brussels bubble. But I think what's really important here is this. I've never heard of any important election where there weren't outsiders trying to influence it. I mean, America influences elections everywhere in the world. So does Britain, so does France and Germany. That's a norm. You expect external actors to try to influence the outcome of an election. But that's part of the democratic process because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, sort of who's trying to influence the election. What matters is whether or not certain ideas resonate with the public or not. And I think what's very important, and this is something that even most Romanian observers recognize, what's really important here is that Georgescu's ideas resonated with the Romanian public at this particular stage in time. And that's really the reality that they're trying to hide and obscure.
And to dig into that, I mean, I've written a piece which touches on this, and I know you've been thinking about this too. The way in which you mentioned Georgescu's kind of history, but he's been quite identified in the past with kind of rural or agricultural causes. He's been a big champion of preserving Romania's forests and forestry heritage and other kind of rural elements. That suggests that, I mean, something we've talked about a lot at MCC Brussels, the kind of way in which the farmers' movement across Europe has had this kind of potentially populist kind of connotation to it. That a similar thing has happened in Romania, where kind of city elites have become wildly out of touch with the concerns and priorities of ordinary Romanians, and that Georgescu, even if he strikes an odd pose on certain topics, he's actually more in touch with those concerns, especially in those rural communities, than the kind of traditional parties located in the cities.
Well, especially in Romania, because in Romania, there's a long tradition of rural populism, and that goes back for a long, long while. And there's a long tradition of what I suppose you could call right-wing environmentalism, where there's a kind of real respect, almost quasi-religious respect for the earth and for the rural way of life. And that's been a central part of Romanian nationalism, all the way going back to the interwar period in the 20s and the 30s. And what Georgescu has done is to kind of mobilize that to some extent and to try to harness that kind of sentiment for his political objectives. So I think in that sense, Romania is in many ways far more committed to this kind of rural political way of life than any other place within Europe.
As you mentioned, Georgescu might have been part of the political scene, but was very much a kind of outsider in the race itself for the presidential election. But one of the really striking things that we mentioned on the podcast before, but bears repeating, is that this was a rejection of the entire political establishment in Romania. And that has really, I think, driven the kind of severity of the response. It's one thing if you have a kind of a hostile or outside actor running up against one of the traditional figures, but the fact that both Georgescu and Elena Lasconi are kind of outside and they're not from the two mainstream parties has really driven the dynamic here. And as well as these traditional or kind of to us now familiar stories about the kind of pro-EU narrative being called into question and that causing a kind of meltdown, there's also the kind of base interests of these two parties that have really driven this decision to annul the election.
Yes, and you have to remember that these two governing parties have been around for a very long time. They were very much seen as being responsible for the dire state of the Romanian economy and the economic difficulties that people are facing in Romania. They're all also linked to a regime of corruption. People don't talk about corruption in Romania, but it's quite endemic. And there's a real dislike and resentment of the political establishment in Romania. So this vote, for the first time, represented an unambiguous crystallization of all that dislike and alienation that the voters had towards the main parties. And that is really why it was so important, because both Georgescu and Lasconi, in their different ways, represented a different alternative to the establishment, and that was the key issue here.
Yeah, and it's to her credit, even those people who might be Georgescu supporters, it's to Lasconi's credit that she also came out and said that the cancelling, the annulling of the election is a real outrage.
It is, yes, yeah.
Coming back here to Brussels, I mean, I was reading the news and I was maybe naively readying myself for some kind of statement from European authorities, from the European Commission or elsewhere, at least acknowledging what has gone on. And for those of us who are familiar with the rule of law obsession of the European Commission, you'd expect them to say that they might be worried about TikTok, but this violates such a fundamental norm of democratic behavior. How have Brussels been so silent on this?
Well, because it's their mates, it's their friends who are at issue here, and Brussels tends to have a kind of a double standard when it comes to political life. And as far as they're concerned, in the case of Romania, the rule of law means basically that the law rules and not the parliament. And this is where we really see how the weaponization of the law, of the judiciary, is so dangerous because, in effect, the Constitutional Court has, in a sense, enacted a coup d'etat. I mean, this is as close as we get to a 1930s kind of anti-democratic coup d'etat that we've seen in a very, very long time. And the very fact that something that is so anti-democratic can be entirely ignored, and the whole failure to acknowledge that by the EU Commission and the people who are usually up in arms about the slightest anti-democratic, sort of act in other parts of the EU, indicates what a danger the EU itself can represent because of their collaboration with what is in effect a kind of a dictatorial move on the part of the courts.
Yeah, and as people have been hauled in front of and dragged to police stations in Romania, Georgescu supporters, etc., I was reminded of the Commission's similarly silent response as Donald Tusk in Poland enacted his own series of kind of minor coups in cultural life and in the judiciary, where again, because it's a so-called friendly figure for the EU, they're silent.
Yes, I think it tells us quite a lot about the perilous state of democracy within the European Union. I mean, we think of the European Union as the beacon of democracy, and historically, democratic culture and democratic public life was fairly advanced, particularly within Western Europe. But what we're now seeing is an incredible degree of democratic backsliding, pretty much tolerated and sometimes even incited by the European Commission to many, many parts of Europe. And that, to me, is a very dangerous precedent. It tells me that democracy is facing a very major challenge to its very existence within the European Union.
Mm. And so from one political democratic crisis to another, last week saw the collapse of the Barnier government in France after he attempted to ram through a deeply unpopular budget. Now, most analysis here is focused on the fact that since Macron's hastily and ill-advisedly called parliamentary elections, there's been these three kind of relatively equal blocks in the French Parliament, and no one's been able to find a kind of compromise to break through. But is this perhaps more so as a symbol of Macron's, like the failure of Macron's vision for France, that you could just have some kind of bland centrist unifying force in France, and that trying to ignore the very real political divisions that exist there?
Yeah, I mean, basically what Macron is doing and Macron is saying is that there is the center, and all the parties that are on the left of it or on the right of it are marginal or should be marginal to the conduct of public affairs within France. And what Macron is trying to do essentially is to enact a kind of technocratic, a managerial technocratic form of rule, which basically limits the role of democratic decision making. So you can see that the parliament in France cannot provide a majority. Macron simply lacks a majority to bring about legislation, to even realize the budget. And therefore, what I fear is going to happen in France if this continues is that Macron is going to find some kind of judicial or constitutional medium through which he can maintain his presidential role, regardless of what Parliament wants. So basically, he will insulate, and this is what I think, this is where it's going, he will try to insulate his own role as president from everything else that's going on within the institutions of French political life. And in that way, you can have another form of almost kind of a coup occurring, where the president itself kind of detaches itself from the electoral process, from the political process.
And I mean, the thing that precipitated this, which is we should remind people how, just how serious a kind of political crisis is in France. It's the first time there's been such a no confidence vote since the 60s. Many people are saying it throws the entire Fifth Republic into question. The whole constitutional order of France has been kind of imperiled by this. But um, the the key figure around this very much is Marine Le Pen and the party of the Rassemblement National. As they've been, some people have said they've been on some kind of respectability drive recently, trying to show that they're respectable partners in government. But something changed here, and is alleged, and Le Pen could no longer back any kind of budget that Macron was willing to put forward. What's changed here, or what's the RN up to?
Well, I think the RM must realize that there's a danger that they will become the prisoners of the kind of centrist political regime that the Macron-Barnier alliance wanted to do. And they realize that the kind of budget that's been put forward by the prime minister is one that's going to be deeply unpopular in France, and it's going to completely sort of call into question the kind of ideals that their own supporters have. So I think that for that reason, the RN decided to move forward. They also realized that there is an attempt to delegitimate a potential Le Pen candidacy for the French president in the future. They're trying to use the courts in the way that they're using the courts everywhere at the moment.
Yeah, there's currently a court case on scheduled against
Exactly,
Le
a
Pen
court
for
case,
some
yes.
kind of misuse of public funds.
That's right. And everybody knows, everybody in the know knows that the whole reason why the court case has been put forward is to try to create a situation that will prevent Le Pen from running for presidency. I mean, that's the basic reason for that. So lawfare is being used in France in anticipation of a possible Le Pen candidacy for presidency and maybe even winning. Pretty much in a way that lawfare is used in Romania, but here it's after the event, because once there, Georgescu actually won the election. So there are a lot of similarities, and the similarities lie in the way that the separation between the judiciary and the political realms have become entirely eroded. And you have the politicization of the courts and the juridification of politics. So this is the dominant trend within Europe itself. And of course, it goes entirely against the EU Commission's obsession with the rule of law, because what it basically says is that the independence of the judiciary is becoming pretty much a fantasy, because what's happening is that the judiciary is playing more and more of a role, interfering in political life.
And one of the kind of slightly perverse ways in which the kind of straitjacket of the EU and European Commission rules has accelerated the crisis in France is precisely because there's a worry that unless they pass some kind of serious reform to pensions or other entitlements or tax rises or such like, that France will be in breach of the EU's budgetary rules as well. And so do you see any way out of this impasse for France? Because the tax cuts are not going to get supported. Tax rises, deeply unpopular. Reforming pension entitlements, very unpopular too. Has France kind of become a prisoner of its situation?
The only possible solution for Macron, which is not the same thing as a solution for France, because their interests may well diverge, is that the EU conveniently forgets some of its financial rules and allows, sort of a greater degree of public expenditure in France. Somehow, it kind of creates a situation where France is allowed or given certain concessions, not to kind of confront the very deep economic crisis that it faces. But that's a temporary solution, because all the time this is happening, Macron is becoming more and more unpopular, and the polarization of French public life is getting more and more intense. So I think we're in for a very interesting year ahead, where the kind of economic problems that France has, it's almost like an economic disease, is one that is shared by a large number of countries within Europe, places like Italy and even Germany that are included. But it's only in France that this has important, immediate political ramifications in terms of the way that the whole idea of constitutional democracy, at least its appearance, is maintained.
Yeah. And I mean, in the office, when this was breaking, we were discussing this, and I know you were quick to say that it's time for Macron to go. Other people in the office maybe thinking that the problems are so broad that even Macron going won't deal with it. Why do you think it's important for Macron to step down?
Well, I think it's only right that an unpopular president who has been responsible for exacerbating the political difficulties by his very narcissistic individual behavior, unnecessarily calling an election at a time when a lot of other issues needed to be confronted. It's only right that his basically realizes that his days are gone, that he's no longer a credible, legitimate president of France. And it's only right that other candidates are given an opportunity to test their support in public. I think that's how democracies should function.
In many ways, a kind of welcome break from the crisis in France was Macron attending the reopening of the Notre Dame. I know, again, in the office, this has kicked off a big debate about whether they've kind of overdone it on the restoration, but regardless, it's a deeply impressive piece of a fix to that awful fire that took out the cathedral. Frank, what did you make of the ceremony? I know it was an opportunity as well for lots of European leaders to cozy up to Trump once again, but what did you make of both the renovation and the ceremony?
Well, I think the renovation was great, and I was really impressed by the speed with which it was executed. When you look at other countries and the way they are not able to meet these kinds of deadlines, I think for some reason this restoration took on an urgency of its own. I think a lot of people realized the importance of the traditional significance of Notre Dame. So I was very impressed with that, and it looked beautiful inside. I thought the ceremony was really very interesting because it was two ceremonies. There was a kind of Catholic religious ceremony, which is what you would expect when you restore an important institution like the cathedral. But there was also the kind of medieval politicking going on. You know, in the medieval days, the church was a place where a lot of business deals were done, where politicians, or in those days, kind of aristocrats, would speak to each other, negotiate, and pretty much the same thing was going on. I thought it was quite fitting that at one point, while Trump, would be soon to be President Trump, is talking to Macron, in the back you can see Elon Musk taking his seat, and you can see that has become a kind of free for all for the kind of the global elites to somehow meet and make decisions and at least try to cultivate some kind of relationship with each other. So I thought it was a very interesting event, all in all.
And yeah, it's interesting you note that it happened relatively quickly. They were able to restore it quite quickly. Reporting has touched on the fact that this is only because using special presidential authority, they exempted all of the renovation work from all of the usual kind of regulations and bureaucracies that apply to construction, renovation, housing, etc. in France. This really, I think, tells you something about the state of regulation in France and beyond. And in fact, today, as we're recording this, we're releasing a new report on how, especially environmental regulation, has really overburdened housing and construction right across the EU. It says something, doesn't it, Frank, when in order to literally get things done, you have to completely exempt all of the regulation that is strangling France.
It is, and I think it reminds us of the Soviet Union in its Stalinist days, when the way they managed to get a nuclear program, or the way they managed to create a space program, was by breaking all the rules, getting around the bureaucracy and prioritizing certain projects. I think what it tells us is that in the European Union, the regulations have become a disease, and regulating becomes an end in itself, particularly for the Brussels bureaucrats. And I think it's about time that politicians in the nations realize that somehow they're going to have to move towards a lighter touch when it comes to regulation than is the case at the moment.
Yeah, we talk a lot at MCC Brussels about finding ways to reinvigorate Europe and kind of allow Europe to take its place once again as a kind of as a place where cutting edge stuff happens. And yeah, breaking that regulatory spirit is kind of part of the same parcel for us as breaking the political deadlock as well.
Exactly. So we need a bonfire of regulations sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty going on this week. It's in the run up to Christmas. We'll have a few things to keep you busy over the festive period. So do stick with us. But for now, thanks so much, Frank, for joining us.
Great to talk to you.
See you again on the MCC Brussels podcast very soon.